In my previous lecture, I characterized one challenge for phenomenal self-consciousness in reason as being able to hold together both the idea that things done are mine, exercises of my subjective authority for which I'm responsible, and the idea that the things done are objective happenings. Moving up a level, we see this as one of two structural aspects of agency. For besides the disparity that action essentially involves between the purpose with which it was performed, which is up to the agent, and its consequences, which are not, there's also the unity that action essentially involves. Hegel construes this hylomorphically as a single content which is translated from the form of something implicit in the practical commitment of the agent to the form of something explicit in the objective deed. I suggested we could think of Hegel's resolution of these challenges to begin with in Davidsonian terms. The disparity is a matter of two different sorts of specifications of a single event. It's a doing because it has specifications under which it's intentional, that is, are endorsed by the attitudes of the agent. But that very same event has consequential specifications, which according to Davidson's accordion principle are to be understood as specifications of the very same event. The intentional specifications, Hegel's Vorsatz, characterize what Hegel calls the action as Handlung, and the consequential specifications characterize what Hegel calls the action as Tat. For Hegel, these correspond to two different social normative perspectives. The individual agent is authoritative concerning the intentional specifications that make something a doing at all. And the community, which attributes responsibility for the doing, is authoritative about specifications of the doing in terms of its ongoing consequences. Its being an alerting of the burglar, a killing, the burning down of the building, the saving of the city, and so on. I want today to address the crucial historical dimension of the articulation of the content of intentional doings, which pairs with this underlying social dimension of the normative articulation of the content. We can think about the unity that the action involves in terms of the success of the individual action in translating her purpose into the objective doings as available to everyone. On a natural way of rendering these claims, the relations between the aspects of unity and difference that the concept of action involves has it that the question of whether those aspects are realized is to be answered differently for each particular performance. That's to say that the relation between these aspects is understood as local, contingent, and disjunctive. It's local in that the assessment of success or failure is made for each action, one by one. It exhibits identity of content of purpose and achievement in case it succeeds, and difference of content of purpose and achievement in case it fails. The possibility of disparity and the ideal of identity of content between purpose and achievement are universal, but those features are each actualized only in some actions. It's contingent whether any particular action succeeds or fails. For instance, whether, as I intended, the ball goes through the hoop. And the two aspects are disjunctively related by exclusive disjunction, because for any given action, either the action succeeds and so exhibits identity of content of purpose and content of achievement, or it fails and so exhibits their disparity. I called this an LCD view of the identity and difference that structures the concept of action. The LCD account is so commonsensical it can be hard so much as to conceive an alternative, but I claimed it's not a view of this shape that Hegel's expressing. Instead, I claimed that in most general terms, Hegel's view of the identity and difference that structures the concept of action is rather global, necessary, and conjunctive. Assessment of success or failure in the ordinary sense, what I tendentiously called vulgar success or failure, is, if not completely irrelevant to understanding the unity and disparity that action involves, at any rate is something that comes into the story only much later. According to a GNC account, every action, so globally, as an action, necessarily, both, conjunctively, simply translates something inner or implicit into something outer or explicit, hence exhibiting the unity of action and the identity of content in the two different forms, and necessarily involves an actual disparity between purpose and achievement, what Hegel calls the distinction that action involves. On this account, if exhibiting the identity of content between purpose and achievement, that is, the unity of action, is in some sense succeeding, and exhibiting a disparity between them is in some sense failing, then in order to understand the GNC approach to the identity through disparity of action, we must appreciate a sense in which every action succeeds and another in which every action fails, regardless of its success or failure in the vulgar sense. And we must come to see these as two sides of one coin, as at least reciprocally sense-dependent concepts playing essential roles in the concept of intentional action. Distinguishing these two sorts of models raises a number of questions. To begin with, how can we make sense of a model of agency of the GNC sort? What philosophical advantages might motivate adopting an account with the GNC structure rather than one with the LCD structure? What reason is there to think that Hegel actually is recommending a GNC-type account? How are we to understand vulgar success and failure if we construe agency in the GNC way? In particular, in what sense do even actions that succeed in the ordinary sense deserve to count as exhibiting the disparity that action involves? It clearly won't do to say that even though the content of what was intended and the content of what was achieved actually coincided, nevertheless they might, had things gone wrong, have diverged, for even an LCD account says that. And in what sense do even actions that fail in the ordinary sense deserve to count as exhibiting the unity of action, of content that action involves? Again, it clearly won't do to say that even though the content of what was intended and the content of what was achieved actually diverged, nevertheless it's their identity that was aimed at, for even an LCD account says that. These are the questions I want to begin by addressing here. The key to the first three, the large philosophical and interpretive questions, is I think contained in the observation that LCD accounts take for granted a notion of determinate content, which can be exhibited indifferently by intentions and the performances to which they give rise. So I can intend to put the ball through the hoop, intend that I put the ball through the hoop, and I can put the ball through the hoop. The notions of assessments of vulgar success and failure, in terms of which both the unity and disparity of intention and accomplishment are defined in LCD approaches, depends on the possibility of identifying and individuating the contents of intentions and achievements antecedently to the processes by which they're related in intentional action, seeking to actualize those intentions in the form of achievements. But Hegel's overall claim is that the notion of determinate conceptual contents is ultimately intelligible only in terms of the process of determining such contents, a process that is both making them more determinate and revealing them as determinate by seeking the objective fulfillment of subjective practical commitments. If we're to understand the sense in which subjective commitments and the objective states of affairs they are fallibly responsible to or authoritative over are determinately contentful, we must understand how the processes and practices that are exercises of intentional agency are intelligible both as the mere expression, revelation, and translation from subjective to objective form of already fully determinate contents, and simultaneously as the means by which initially less determinate contents become more determinate, the process of determining conceptual contents. The former perspective is that of the unity of action and the identity of contents realized in it, and the latter is that of the disparity of action and the difference between the content subjectively intended and the content objectively achieved. The difference between an approach that presupposes a notion of determinate content without deploying the resources to make intelligible its nature, origin, or accessibility to finite knowers and agents, on the one hand, and one that concerns itself precisely with explaining determinateness of conceptual content in terms of the processes and practices by which such contents arrive, develop, and are deployed by knowers and agents, on the other hand, is just the difference between the standpoint of Verstand and that of Vernunft, as those Hegelian meta-meta concepts have been brought into view. It's in the treatment of agency that Hegel explains the process by which conceptual norms become or are revealed as determinate. In particular, it's here that we see how the social and historical articulation of what he calls the cycle of action interact to define a new notion of determinateness, conceived according to the meta-concepts of Vernunft. The difference between the LCD and the GNC understandings of the relations between the unity and disparity that the concept of action involve turns on two different senses in which an action can succeed. An action is successful in the ordinary non-philosophical sense just in case the purpose for the sake of which it was performed, and in virtue of which the performance is intentional, and so a doing at all, ends up as one of the consequential specifications of that doing. The sense of success that Hegel is articulating depends on determining the content of the doing. Success consists in a functional role in the process by which the Handlung becomes the Tat and the Vorsatz develops into the Absicht. In his Reason chapter, Hegel enriches the conception of Erfahrung as the experience of error, which he'd introduced in the introduction. Here we consider instead what he calls the cycle of cognition and action, a test-operate, test-exit cycle, a TOTE cycle, of cognition and action that develops content through the experience of practical failure as well as cognitive error. By contrast to Davidson, for Hegel, the paradigmatic examples of doings are not punctiform events, such as switch flippings and jumpings, but extended processes, such as building a house, writing a book, or passing a law. Such processes have a substantial internal historical developmental structure. To begin with, the microstructure of any action process reveals a distinctive sort of evolution. Any prior intention that's successfully fulfilled must progress to a demonstratively specifiable performance. I will raise my arm in 1 minute. I will raise my arm in 30 seconds. I raise my arm now. But at this point in the process, the general description can also be replaced by a demonstrative specification. I do this now. The realization of any particular sub-goal, one unit of the extended action for which the intention serves as a norm, must include an evolution of intentional specifications from the less definite to the more definite, from the more general descriptions to completely particular demonstrative specifications. I start off with reasons leading me to endorse the purpose of making it true that phi of t, say that the north wall of the house has a doorway in it. But to carry through the intention that governs the process of achieving that end, I must eventually reach a phase in which I intend to do this here, now. Say, nail this board between these two, here and now. I cannot merely make true the further determinable, abstract general description that expressed the content of my original commitment without doing so by making true a fully determinate, concrete, demonstrative specification. We can recall from the discussion of the sense certainty chapter that an essential feature of observational or perceptual processes was seen to be the transition from unrepeatable demonstrative specifications, in Hegel's example, night now or tree here, to repeatable, hence potentially inferentially significant expressions, night then, tree there. And the link before them was in broad terms anaphoric, a matter of picking up the demonstratives by using pronouns that have them as antecedents. Though then and there also have demonstrative uses, it's their anaphoric uses that matter for recollecting other demonstrative uses so as to make them subsequently available, in general, after redemonstration is no longer possible, for use as premises and inferences. This was the first sort of recollection, in Hegel's term Erinnerung, mentioned in the body of the phenomenology. The anaphoric link is a matter of the acknowledged authority of the antecedent over the content of the anaphoric dependent, the pronoun's responsibility to its antecedent for what it represents and expresses. This historical, normative, inferential structure linking unrepeatable demonstrative tokenings and repeatable anaphorically dependent tokenings on the cognitive or theoretical side of a subject's activities provides conceptual raw materials that are helpful also for thinking about the maturation of a prior general purpose into a later concrete doing on the practical side of the subject's activity. In this case, what matters is the sense in which an earlier description of what is to be done can be thought of as inheriting some of its content from the later demonstrative specification of what is done, on which it is understood to be anaphorically dependent. To begin with, in the case of successful actions, the demonstratively specifiable performance that fulfills the purpose or intention can be thought of as what was aimed at all along. I meant to do that, or that is what I intended to do. By way of analogy, consider how one might think of the phenomenon of speaker's reference in terms of demonstratives and anaphora. And this phenomenon on the theoretical side of cognition is mirrored on the practical side of agency. The distinction between the success and failure of an action in the ordinary sense is underwritten by looking at the semantic reference of the descriptions that I would acknowledge as expressions of my purpose. This is the dictum I am trying to make true, the de dicto specification of my purpose. And if that same description does not occur in the consequential characterizations of the deed that encompasses my doing, then I failed. But there's another sense in which whatever I actually did determines the content of my intention under the actual circumstances in which I acted. Under the actual circumstances, having the purpose I did amounted to intending to do that, whatever I actually achieved. Intending to turn on the light by flipping the switch was, under the actual circumstances in which I intended it, though unbeknownst to me, intending of a particular act of burglar alerting that I do that. Compare. My claiming that the man in the corner drinking champagne is an economist was, in the actual circumstances, though unbeknownst to me, claiming of a man drinking ginger ale that he's an economist. We can distinguish between what I meant and what I said. But in fact, we're talking about two ways of specifying the content of one saying. I said that the man in the corner drinking champagne is an economist. But I said of the one drinking ginger ale that he was an economist. One of the lessons of sense certainty is that I cannot merely or immediately mean one or the other of them. I can do that only with conceptual mediation, by having some other inferentially articulated and significant specification available. And we can see in this case that the distinction between what I said and what I was talking about, in the sense of what my words semantically referred to and what the speaker referred to, arises only from a third-person point of view. I cannot myself, at the time of utterance, separate my speaker reference from my semantic reference. That requires adopting the perspective of someone else, someone who has different information than I do, someone who can attribute a different responsibility to me than that I acknowledge, by linking my utterance anaphorically to other possible utterances of mine. From that third-person point of view, there are two ways to assess the commitment I've made, the responsibility I've undertaken by my claim. And this phenomenon on the theoretical side of cognition is mirrored on the practical side of agency. The distinction between the success and failure of an action in the ordinary sense is underwritten by looking at the semantic reference of the descriptions that I would acknowledge as expressions of my purpose. This is the dictum that I'm trying to make true, the de dicto specification of my purpose. And if that same description does not occur in the consequential characterizations of the deed, then I failed. But there's another sense in which whatever I actually did determines the content of my doing. In this sense, the content of the responsibility I've undertaken in the form of my intention is inherited from the actual deed. Here, the thought is that it's the very same intention that matures from being describable in the most theoretical terms, turning on the light by flipping the switch, to being specifiable in the most immediate demonstrative terms, doing this now. From this point of view, not available to the agent ab initio, the final demonstrative picks out what we were all along referring to. Prospectively, the agent can only pick it out by descriptions that may or may not semantically refer to it. But retrospectively, we can tell what the actual content of the intention was, given the possibly unknown circumstances in which it was to be actualized. Responsibility in this sense is attributed by discerning a kind of forward anaphora, where the expression uttered earlier in a discourse inherits its content from an antecedent uttered only later in the discourse. The content of the action can be specified either de dicto, that, in terms of the purpose that authorized it, or de re, of, in terms of what was thereby in fact authorized. Understanding the concept of action requires understanding actions as unities that necessarily involve this distinction of perspective, and understanding those perspectives as perspectives on one content. The content of the intention, in Hegel's use of Absicht, is the content of the action. The purpose and the accomplished deed are then two perspectives on that content, two forms that content can take. That's the agentive correlate of the cognitive hylomorphism that appeared already in Hegel's introduction. The intention that, as a norm, governs the process of achieving an end can be thought of as a universal content discernible in all phases of that process, from implicit initial subjective endorsing of the end to its explicit objective achievement. One way in which such an intention can develop so as to culminate in the successful actualization of its purpose is as the gradual sequential realization of a tree-structured plan, in which various means are envisaged as sufficient for the achievement of, say, sub-goals. Collections of those as sufficient for the achievement of sub-goals, and the sub-goals as sufficient to the achievement of the endorsed end. If the plan is a good one, and nothing goes wrong, then all the various sub-goals will be achieved, and by their means in sequence the sub-goals, and so in the final phase the ultimate aim. But that's not the only way an initial plan can lead to a successful conclusion. For the fact that under the actual, initially incompletely known circumstances, some sub-goal is not achievable, or that realizing all the sub-goals thought to be sufficient to accomplish some sub-goal turned out not to do the trick, need not be fatal to the success of the overall enterprise. They need not lead to failure to fulfill the intention or achieve the ultimate end. Failure to achieve a sub-goal need not be fatal to the whole enterprise, for the internal details of the plan may be adjusted depending on how things turn out in actuality, so as to find some other path to the same ultimate goal. And just as failure to achieve a sub-goal need not be sufficient for failure to achieve the goal to which it is plan-related as means, so success in achieving a sub-goal need not be sufficient for success in achieving the goal to which it's plans related as a means. Here we see a substantial transformation and development of the conception of Erfahrung from the experience of error to what Hegel now talks about as the cycle of action, in which individuality, as he says, exhibits itself simply and solely as the unity of the world given and the world it has made. End of the quote. Fulfilling a complex intention is a cyclical process of intervention according to a plan aimed at a goal, observation of the results of the intervention, adjustment of the plan, further intervention, further observation of its results, and so on. It's the dynamic structure of a test-operate, test-exit loop. This is the form of processes by which necessity is incorporated into contingent actuality. That is, an endorsed end is actualized, what Hegel talks about as the world it has made. It's also through processes with this structure that contingency is incorporated in necessity, in that the norm or plan governing the process changes in response to actual circumstances and achievements. That's what Hegel's referring to as the world given. If we compare the plans operative at different times during such a process, they're liable to be different. This is what Hegel calls the character of action as a transition and a movement. Each of these purposes and plans, some subordinate to or nested in others, some adopted at different times during the process of realizing others, provides a context within which we can assess the functional success or failure of the project of achieving a sub-goal. Hegel says that in contrast to the purpose or end, quote, the particular aspect which gives the action its subjective value and interest for me, when the local particular purpose is put into a larger context, quote, the immediate character of an action and its further content is reduced to a means. Insofar as such an end is a finite one, it may in turn be reduced to a means to some further intention, and so on in an infinite progression. End of the quote. That is, each larger or newly adopted goal provides a new context with respect to which the instrumental contribution, and so the functional success or failure, of each prior achievement can be assessed. These assessments are essentially retrospective, as indeed are assessments of ordinary success or failure at achieving the most local purpose. But because there's no end in principle to the progression to a larger or later enterprise, to larger or later purposes, it's never too late for the new context to arise within which a previously failed project can count as successfully contributing to the realization of a plan. And even the abandonment of a previously endorsed end, perhaps as a result of persistent failure to achieve it, can, when later suitably recontexted, come to have the significance merely of a change of plan for achieving a larger or later purpose. The development of an intention by the alteration of a plan involves sacrificing some commitments to the rejected plan, perhaps to some of the sub-goals it endorsed, and thereby identifying with others. We saw that the process by which self-conscious individual selves constitute themselves in a recognitive community is also a process of relinquishing or altering, in general sacrificing some commitments in favor of other incompatible ones, which one thereby counts as identifying with. We're now in a position to see that intentional action is a process that has just this self-constituting structure. The process of carrying through an intention is a process of self-determination or self-constitution, making oneself into a more determinately contentful self by identifying with some commitments and rejecting others. That's why, quote, what the subject is the series of its actions, end quote. It's why individuality is the cycle of its action, and why an individual cannot know what he is until he's made himself a reality through action, end of the quotes. The very same process that's the exercise of intentional agency is at the same time the expression of self-conscious individuality. Hegel says, quote, the essential nature of the work is to be an expression of individuality, end of the quote. One place to start in understanding this is with the observation that once agency is understood as necessarily being the expression of self-conscious individuality, that the individual's self-consciousness expresses itself by working to fulfill its practical commitments, that can be thought of as a kind of overarching end or purpose to which one is implicitly committed simply by any exercise of intentional agency. Hegel says, quote, the activity of individuality, all that it does, is in its own self an end, the present real existence of the process of individuality, end of the quote. Individuality in its setting forth or expression is in relation to action the end in and for itself. The important point is that if we think of this as an overarching aim, to which whatever one does is instrumentally subordinate, then it has the distinctive feature that in realizing this goal, the agent, as Hegel says, encounters no resistance from the actual world. For from this point of view, self-consciousness is, quote, reality in the form of an individuality that directly expresses itself, an individuality which no longer encounters resistance from an actual world, and whose aim and object are only this expressing of itself, end of the quote. For expressing self-conscious individuality is not something one can try to do and fail. It's part of the concept of agency that whatever one does is the explicit expression of what the individual agent implicitly is. From the point of view of Verstand's focus on the vulgar finite conception of success and failure, actuality shows up in the form of stubborn recalcitrance, opacity to knowledge of contingent circumstances, and resistance to the realization of determinate purposes. The distinction that action involves is to the fore. By contrast, from the perspective afforded by treating the expression of individual self-consciousness in its work and deeds as a purpose with respect to which the instrumental contribution of determinate purposes can be assessed, actuality shows up as what Hegel calls the transparent medium of self-expression. He says, quote, the element in which individuality sets forth its shape has the significance solely of putting on the shape of individuality. It's the daylight in which consciousness wants to display itself, end quote. From this point of view, objective actuality just is the medium of self-expression. In practical agency, expression is actualization. What one is implicitly for oneself becomes explicit as something actual, something with a nature in itself, available in that form for others, as well as for oneself in this new form. To see our authority as agents, as opposed, resisted, frustrated by recalcitrant actuality, is to commit to a model of pure independence, what Hegel talks about allegorically under the heading of mastery. On this view, authority is not real unless it's total. But we need to make the move from independence to freedom, from Verstand to Vernunft, to understand genuine authority as always and necessarily coming with correlative responsibility, for only so can it be determinately contentful. This is the structure of authority and responsibility of reciprocal recognition, which in the case of agency is articulated both socially and historically. One way of thinking about what the master got wrong is that he was still working with a one-sorted notion of normativity, not a two-sorted one. That is, correct, incorrect, appropriate, inappropriate, those are really one-sorted normative categories. Talk of independence and dependence connives at this, for those can seem like exclusive alternatives. Either something is independent or it's dependent. It can't be both, at least not in the same regard. But that's understanding independence as pure independence, as unmixed with any coordinate dependence. But if, as I recommend, we think of Hegel's talk of independence as talk of authority, and of dependence as responsibility, corresponding to a two-sorted categorization of normative statuses, there's commitments and entitlements, there's authority and responsibility, then we make room for the possibility that authority always comes with correlative responsibility. Not just in the sense that if X has authority over Y, Y has responsibility to X, because that's still one-sorted, master's conception, and independence and dependence could be understood to stand in this relation one-sortedly, in the sense that but what we want is the sense in which if X is authoritative, X is always also responsible. And if Y is responsible, Y is always also authoritative. My Hegel takes that sort of reciprocity to be essential to determinate contentfulness. Explicitly expressing in the medium of actuality what an individual's self-consciousness implicitly is not just one more determinate purpose which an agent might or might not endorse, at the same level as writing a phenomenology of spirit, building a house, or putting on a dinner party. It's clearly a second-order phenomenon, in this way like the purpose of accomplishing one's purposes. That one, too, is one that any intentional agent could be said implicitly to endorse, though unlike self-expression, it's not one that's guaranteed to be satisfied. Both are really, though, ways of talking about the structure of agency as such, rather than something peculiar to any particular exercise of it. But we can ask, is there any point to thinking of self-expression as self-actualization as itself an end, especially given its immunity to failed attempts to realize it? Why isn't that just a misleading façon de parler? The point for Hegel seems to be that the way of thinking about the objective realm of how things actually, concretely and contingently are in themselves, that he sees this expressive idiom opening up as the artist's raw materials, the medium, the theater of self-expression and self-realization. Explicating this idiom of self-expression through actualization by the exercise of intentional agency is to complete the three-stage metaconceptual progression in ways of conceiving how things stand between the subjective idiom of certainty and the objective idiom of truth. This is what I've called conceptual idealism. Explicating this idiom of expression through actualization by the exercise of intentional agency comprises three successive claims. Conceptual realism, the claim of the ontological homogeneity of content between what things are in themselves and what they are for consciousness. Both are conceptually structured, that is, articulated by determinate negation and mediation, incompatibilities and consequences. Second claim, objective idealism, the reciprocal sense dependence of the concepts by which we characterize objective relations of incompatibility and consequence on the one hand, and subjective processes of resolving incompatibilities and drawing inferences on the other hand. And finally, what I've called conceptual idealism, that the constellation of objective, conceptually articulating relations and subjective, conceptually articulating processes should be understood in the first instance in terms of the process that is the cycle of intentional action, perception, thought, action, and further perception, and only derivatively in terms of the relations induced by that process. I want to talk in these terms about the relation between Hegelian and Fregean understandings of the Fregean notions of sense and reference. According to the claim I've been calling conceptual idealism, the second-order relations between what things objectively are in themselves and the experiential processes in which they show up as something for consciousness are to be understood in the first instance in terms of those subject-constitutive empirical practical processes, what Hegel calls Erfahrung, now understood as the cycle of action and cognition. This thesis is the assertion of an asymmetric explanatory priority of subjective processes over objective relations, downstream from, added to, built on top of, the symmetric reciprocal sense-dependent relations I've discussed under the heading of objective idealism. The relations between what things are for consciousness and what they are in themselves are the relations between phenomena and noumena, appearance and reality, as Hegel construes them. Frege's notions of sense and reference are his theoretical renderings of two semantic dimensions that are already familiar from our ordinary pre-systematic ways of talking and thinking about talking and thinking. For we distinguish what we're saying or thinking from what we're talking or thinking about. Talk of phenomena, the way things appear to us, what they are for us, is talk about the kind of understanding of them we exhibit by applying concepts to them in judgment and action. In broadly Fregean terms, what we grasp that presents objects and their relations to us, makes them something for us, is senses. It's in virtue of grasping those senses, having Fregean thoughts, that we come to stand in referential or representational relations to the objects and relations that are thereby presented to us. The reference determined by and presented to us by those senses are the objective things and relations our thoughts and judgments are about. To say that the reference are what we're talking and thinking about, what we're acting on, is to say that those things and their relations, it's those things and their relations that set standards for the normative assessment of the truth of our judgments, the material correctness of our inferences, and the success of our actions. Just so, how things are in themselves, the noumena, the reality, determines how they ought to be for consciousness, for phenomena, for appearances. A suitable mapping of Hegel's semantic vocabulary onto a more contemporary neo-Fregean one will enable us to see Hegel as offering a novel, interesting, and potentially valuable account of the relations between the concepts of sense and reference. For Frege, words express senses, which is what we in the first instance understand. The senses of declarative sentences are thoughts, things that can be assessed as true or false. By expressing a sense, words represent reference, the things one is thereby talking or thinking about. The senses semantically fix or determine the reference. In virtue of that semantic relation, senses have the cognitive significance of being modes of presentation of their reference. They're accordingly representings of those representeds. Of course, Hegel's understanding of what corresponds to the Fregean notion of sense is in crucial ways quite different from Frege's. To begin with, Hegel's a holist about the conceptual contents we grasp in thought and express in speech and action. For Hegel, conceptual contents are identified and individuated by their place in a network, articulated by relations of determinate negation and mediation, that is, material incompatibility and so material inference. Grasp of them consists in the capacity to move around in that network according to those relations, acknowledging the normative force in their normative force in the experiential process of resolving incompatible commitments, both practical and cognitive, extracting inferential consequences of both sorts, and elaborating, pursuing, and adjusting plans in the cycle of action and judgment. The conceptual contents of judgments and intentions, remember Hegel saying, what the deed is can be said of it, the ways things can be for consciousness, are not, for Hegel, intelligible one by one or even in a static snapshot, apart from their roles in relational networks and processes of practically acknowledging error and failure. By contrast, however it might be with Frege himself, many contemporary neo-Fregean theories are thoroughly atomistic about senses. Another significant difference is that Frege discusses senses exclusively in the context of theoretical or cognitive activity, paradigmatically judging. However, Hegel is at least equally interested in the relations between how things are for consciousness and how things are in themselves that are instituted by practical activity. In that case, what the deed is for the agent, the analog of sense, is a matter of the agent's acknowledging of responsibility by endorsement of purposes, in virtue of which the deed has specifications under which it's intentional. And what the deed is in itself, the analog of a referent, is a matter of potential audiences attributing of responsibility for the deed, subsequently specifiable in consequential terms. That the very same deed can be picked out both in terms of what it is for the agent and what it is for others, both prospectively in intention and retrospectively in consequences, that these two senses can pick out the same referent is the basis of the identity and difference that is the process of experience, which in the reason chapter becomes visible as having the structure of a cycle of action and cognition. The fact that some consequential specification can be at once an aspect of what the deed is in itself and what it is for others, indeed for the agent herself, points to another important and distinctive feature of Hegel's construal. For another axial divergence between Fregean and Hegelian construals of sense and reference concerns their categorical heterogeneity or homogeneity. For Frege, senses and reference are different kinds of things. Senses are not like the crystals, carrots, and cats that make up the world we talk about. Thoughts and other expression senses occupy a distinct realm of sense, a third world of directly graspable or intelligible items, to be identified neither with subjective ideas nor with the objective occupants of the actual causal or even logical orders. Frege doesn't tell us a lot about what sorts of things senses are, though they're evidently things that can stand in inferential incompatibility relations with each other. But Frege is explicit that for him they're ontologically sui generis, and the realm of senses is largely disjoint from the realm of reference. For Hegel, though, the way things are for consciousness can be just the same as the way they are in themselves. Noumena are a kind of phenomena. They're categorically homogeneous, the same kind of thing. For the basic tenet of Hegel's conceptual realism is that both phenomena and noumena, both the way things are for consciousness and the way they are in themselves, are conceptually articulated. That is, they stand in relations of material incompatibility and material consequence. Hegel warns us in the introduction against construing the subjective realm of certainty and the objective realm of truth in ways that excavate an ultimately unbridgeable gulf between them, one that would, in Fregean terms, make unintelligible how senses could be cognitive modes of presentation of objects to subjects and could semantically determine what representeds they are representings of. Hegel's first move is to come up with a notion of conceptual articulation that applies equally to the world we act in and on and know about, on the one hand, and to our thoughts about it, on the other. Both sorts of things are accordingly the sort of thing that are in the right shape to be grasped or understood. Not immediately, but the mediation is a matter of material, inferential, and incompatibility relations to other graspables of just the same sort. That's the holist point. A further significant difference between Hegel's and Frege's versions of the sense-reference distinction, besides the issue of semantic holism versus atomism concerning senses, the inclusion versus exclusion of the practical role of senses in intentional agency, and the categorical homogeneity or heterogeneity of senses and references, with its consequences for how one can think about what grasp of senses consist in, A further significant difference concerns the understanding of the determinateness of senses. Phrygian senses are required to determine classes of reference whose boundaries are sharp, fixed, and complete. To say they're sharp is to say that it's impossible for any possible object to fall partially in the class determined by the sense, or both to fall in it and to fall outside it. To say that the references are fixed is to say that the boundaries of the class of reference determined by the sense don't change. Which sense a given sign expresses may change for Frege if the use of the sign changes, but the senses themselves don't change. To say that the boundaries of the class of references is complete is to say that the sense determines a partition of the possible candidates. Every particular is classified by the sense either as falling under the concept it determines or as not falling under it. This is Phrygian determinateness, or determinateness in the Phrygian sense. In taking it that acknowledging the incompatibility of one's commitments obliges one to change them, one is taking how things are for one to answer to a standard of how they are in themselves. That is taking them to be about something, to be appearances of a reality, to be phenomena presenting some noumena, to be senses presenting reference. In short, ways things are for a subject rather than merely states of a subject. This is the shape of a story about referential purport in general, what it is for a conceptual content, a sense, so much as to seem to be, or to be put forward as, to function practically for the subject as being about or representing how things objectively are. So what one must do in order thereby to be taking it that one is talking or thinking about something is to perform a recollection, an Erinnerung, of the development of one's views. For constructing that sort of expressively progressive genealogy is exhibiting the sequential experiential transformations of what things are for one as governed, guided, and controlled by how things all along were in themselves. Distinguishing in this way between expressively progressive transformations and those alterations in how one applies those very same concepts that were not expressively progressive is treating all the prior applications of those concepts as subject to assessment according to the normative standards set by how things have been revealed so far really to be, the actual objective facts and intentions, and the material incompatibilities and consequential relations that really articulated those properties and relations. And that is treating them all as appearances of that one reality, all phenomena presenting one noumenal situation. And that's to say that performing such a recollection is treating all the senses as cognitively presenting the referent, in that they actually produce our conception of it as the culmination of the reconstructed trajectory through the actual course of development. And those same senses semantically determine the referent in that they're exhibited as having been all along imperfect and incomplete expressions of it, in the sense that that referent, the way things are in themselves, sets the norm that distinguishes expressively progressive from expressively retrogressive experiential steps, the difference between more and less revelatory appearances. On this Hegelian account, the link between sense and reference is in the first instance an expressive one. The senses express the reference, making some aspects of it explicit. It's a relation established retrospectively, by turning a past into a history, an expressive genealogy. And it's in terms of this retrospectively discerned expressive relation that the representational dimension of concept use is explained. Expressive genealogies reconstruct experiential processes into traditions. So it's the retrospectively discerned reconstruction of a rational, in the sense of expressively progressive tradition, that ties together sense and referent. Where for Frege, it was a truth relation, making true, that connects them. For Hegel, it's this truth process, progressively expressing more truly, that secures the cognitive and semantic relations between senses and their reference. This structure is what supports the asymmetric sense-dependence relation asserted by conceptual idealism. We must reconstrue the concept determinate, so as to think of it in the first instance as a feature of the whole process of determining conceptual contents, and only derivatively of the snapshot stages of that process, rather than the other way around. We must distinguish determinate in the sense of Verstand from determinate in the sense of Vernunft. The meta-concept of concepts that are determinate in the Verstand sense is the idea of a universal that settles for every particular, whether or not the particular falls under the universal, independently of any consideration of the process of determining the boundaries of that universal. This is the Kantian Fregean idea that Hegel thinks is ultimately incoherent. He thinks there are no concepts that are determinate in the Verstand sense, that really, never mind finally or fully, articulate the world. There are concepts that are determinate in the Vernunft sense. These are the very concepts that we're deploying now. But they articulate the world only via the process of refining them, a process that in principle has no endpoint. It's the process that is the truth, he says. Thinking that it must have an endpoint, on pain of leaving an unconceptualizable residue, is looking for determinateness in the Verstand sense. The concept of determinate in the Verstand sense is what you get if you take one of the perspectives, the retrospective Whiggish one, and understand the relation between the whole process, including the perspective shift to a new Whiggish story, on the model of how things look from within just one of those recollective stories. This is one-sidedly mistaking one aspect of the process, one perspective on it, for the whole thing. The only way to ask whether one concept slice is correct or not is to ask about whether the content of the concept it's a temporal slice of is correct or not. And that's to ask about the whole unfolding process of becoming more explicit. I said that the home language game of Frege's distinction between sense and reference is empirical, cognitive, or theoretical discourse. But by the time we've reached the discussion in the Reason chapter, we know that the process Hegel calls Erfahrung in general has the structure of a test-operate, test-exit cycle of action and cognition. In the cognitive phases of such a cycle, what's revealed by an expressively progressive process of transformation is what it is for consciousness. It's what the world is in itself. But there's also the practical phases in which what is revealed by an expressively progressive process of transformation of what it is for consciousness is what the self is, rather than what the world is. In fact, the model for the retrospective discernment of the implicit unity of a course of experience, the development of what things are for consciousness in the direction of what they are in themselves, is to be found on the practical side of intentional action. While the initially endorsed purpose, in virtue of which a process counts as intentional, and hence an action, something done, embodies a de dicto specification of the intention, and at least in a speaker's referring way, the whole deed, it's only retrospectively, from the point of view of the accomplished deed, that a de re specification of that intention is available. Of course, further consequential specification of the deed, and hence de re specifications of the intention, never cease to become available as the causal consequences of what is done ripple outward. We're to understand the way the referent attributed by a retrospective recollection of a course of experience on the cognitive side furnishes a standard for the normative assessment of the variously revised and transformed senses that are thereby taken to express it, in terms of how the intention expressed by a retrospective recollection of an extended action process from the point of view of the deed accomplished furnishes a standard for the normative assessment of the variously revised and transformed plans that are thereby taken to express it. The reason one can only tell the intention from the deed is that the intention is primarily manifested in the whole evolving plan, and only secondarily in any individual time slice of it. Thus, it's only retrospectively available. Intentions in this sense are the guiding norms on the practical side that we're to use as the model of facts, which guide the development of concepts on the theoretical side. Experience necessarily involves reflection on one's concepts and commitments, an active taking of responsibility for them, and exercise of authority over them, identifying with some by sacrificing others. Those choices and endorsements, normative identifications and sacrifices, are phases of the ongoing experiential process by which, on the one hand, self-conscious individual selves are determined, and the other, the subjective constellation of concepts and commitments, how things are for the subject, is further determined by incorporating aspects of how things are in themselves. That's why, as Hegel says, quote, the individual being is what the deed is, and why individuality is what its world is, the world that is its own. Individuality is itself the cycle of its action, in which what has exhibited itself as an actual world. The model for this on the side of practical agency is the way the de re specification of the content of an intention, a kind of sense, changes when new consequences occur, so that new consequential descriptions become available. Retrospectively, we learn something about what we in fact intended, so we can see that very intention as being further expressed. Prospectively, since the consequence is not foreseeable, it hasn't happened yet, this same process appears as further determination of it. The prior sense or intention appears indeterminate in the snapshot Fregean sense, since it hasn't yet been settled whether that consequential description is a specification of it. Thus, what appears from a retrospective point of view as a change of Fregeanly determinate but not wholly correct senses, one giving rise to another with each experiential episode, from the prospective point of view shows up as the filling in of an intention or sense as the process of action develops. One can see that various consequential descriptions might or might not contingently turn out to be true of what one is doing. One can see that application of concepts to novel particulars could turn out to be either appropriate or inappropriate. Determination and expression are two ways of looking at one kind of process. They're just prospective and retrospective perspectives, respectively. Telling the right kind of retrospective story is giving the process of development that issues in the final sense, and so determines the referent, the shape of a plan. Doing that also involves making choices among alternatives and formulating a plan to secure a result. The purpose is to pick out the actual developmental trajectory of appearance elements structured in what could be called an expressive plan. This is a de re specification of an intention retrospectively discernible from the achievement of the currently endorsed sense. Only revision moves get included in it that contribute to the goal, that is, that can be seen retrospectively to have been functionally successful in realizing the purpose, achieving the goal. The sub-goals of an expressive plan are expressively progressive revisions, ones whose resulting sense is a move in the direction of the reference sense that retrospectively serves as the normative standard for assessing the expressive success of all the senses that arose earlier in the process. And it's entirely compatible with being a functional expressive success in this sense that a revision move be a local failure in the vulgar or ordinary sense, in that it immediately led to a further incompatibility. Just as in the ordinary cases of intentional agency, vulgar success or failure to achieve an immediate purpose doesn't settle the question of the functional success or failure in contributing to the execution of a plan aimed at a larger or more distant purpose. And in any case, every revision will be found eventually to occasion a further experience of incompatibility, requiring a further revision. Stability of conception is for Hegel at best a temporary achievement, one that's in principle not just fragile, but doomed to eventual disruption. The movement of experience is what incorporates concrete particularity into the content of universals, what gives matter-of-factual contingency the form of normative necessity, what mediates immediacy. All the particular contingent immediacy of things has never been and never will be already expressed or expressible in a constellation of determinate concepts and commitments. And this fact about the permanent prospective, empirical practical inadequacy of any set of conceptual commitments means that each currently endorsed constellation that provides the reality standard for extracting an expressive genealogy from what then show up as its antecedent appearances will itself eventually be unmasked as the appearance of some other reality, perhaps only somewhat different, but in some cases significantly and substantially so. And in fact, doing the prospective work of coming up with a new revision and doing the retrospective work of coming up with a new recollection that exhibits that new revision as the culmination of an expressively progressive process in which what was implicit is made gradually but cumulatively more explicit are two ways of describing one task. The second phase of each experiential episode can then be thought in two essential and essentially complementary ways from two different points of view. Regarded prospectively, from the point of view of practical deliberation, the subject or agent is obliged by the acknowledgement of commitments standing in relations of incompatibility to do something to the concepts and commitments he's inherited, to alter them so as to remove the incompatibility. In a broad sense, this is further determining the contents of those concepts and commitments by incorporating into how things are for one the empirical practical information that's provided by the fact that applying the conceptual norms one currently endorses has led one to contradicting oneself. That constellation of concepts and commitments must then, according to its own implicit norms, be revised, refashioned, remade. It's a criterion of adequacy on succeeding at this practical task that one can tell a retrospective story about how, if things are as the revised constellation of concepts and commitments takes them to be in themselves, one found that out by a privileged subsequence of the actual experiential episodes one underwent that made them something for you. And regarded retrospectively, from the point of view of the assessment of the experiential transformation, that remaking must be exhibited as the culmination of a process by which what was all along implicit in the concepts one endorsed and the commitments one undertook in applying them becomes gradually more explicit. That is, one must exhibit the result of one's revision as finding out how things all along already were in themselves, what one was really talking and thinking about, what one was referring to by deploying the earlier variously defective senses, the reality that was all along appearing, though in some aspects incompletely or incorrectly. The disparity of the senses, the appearances, the phenomena, the ways things are for consciousness, that's manifest prospectively in the need to revise yet again the contents and commitments one currently endorses, and the unity of reference of reality, noumena, ways things are in themselves, that's manifest retrospectively in their gradual emergence into explicitness as revealed by an expressive genealogy of the contents and commitments one currently endorses, are two sides of one coin, each intelligible only in a context that contains the other. So the sense in which many alternatives are prospectively open to the subject-agent of experience in the second phase of an experiential episode is just that many different revisions could be retrospectively rationalized by different expressive genealogies. Hence, there are many different references those senses could be taken to determine semantically and present cognitively. On the other hand, the actual applications of concepts that lead to experiential choices of revision, identification with some features of the constellation of concepts and commitments through sacrifice of others, provide the raw materials that must be selected and arranged into expressively progressive, rationally reconstructed traditions that vindicate the current conceptual constellation as the reference, both semantically determined and cognitively presented by all the senses from which the expressively privileged trajectory is drawn. The process by which what Hegel calls the concept develops as constellations of conceptual contents and commitments are found wanting and replaced or revised, which is the same process by which individual self-consciousnesses develop, must be thought of as both a process of ever greater determination of conceptual contents and of ever greater expression of them. Regarded prospectively, the conceptual contents are being made more determinate as features of how things really are in themselves, are incorporated into how they are for consciousness by crucial experiential episodes. Regarded retrospectively, the conceptual contents are being gradually but inexorably, with retrospective necessity, revealed and expressed. What was all along implicit is being made more and more explicit. The key to the Hegelian semantic vision is the talk of the process of sequentially and progressively determining disparate senses in the sense of making them more determinate, and talk of the process of sequentially and progressively expressing, that is, making more explicit reference, are necessarily two ways of talking about one and the same process. Thank you.